The cantina on Zirian Station buzzed with the familiar sounds of interspecies military life. Glasses clinked against chitin, metal, and crystalline appendages as soldiers from across the Galactic Defense Coalition unwound after another grueling training cycle. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric preferences of dozens of species, creating a slightly metallic taste that had become synonymous with military installations throughout the galaxy. Captain Zexhai of the Vorthak Empire lounged in his specially designed chair, his 6 arms gesturing expressively as he regaled his audience with tales of his people's legendary military prowess. His carapace gleamed under the artificial lighting, each segment polished to perfection as befitted an officer of his standing. Around him, representatives of various species listened with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. And that, Zexhai concluded with a flourish of his primary arms, is how a single Vorthak battalion held off an entire Krillian assault fleet for 72 standard hours without reinforcement. His mandibles clicked together in what his species considered a satisfied smile. Lieutenant Therias of the Serpentine Collective flicked her forked tongue dismissively. Her scaled skin shifted from green to a mottled yellow, indicating amusement tinged with doubt. 72 hours? Your species does enjoy its exaggerations, Captain. Though I suppose when your reflexes are naturally 3 times slower than a serpentine's, any extended engagement must feel like an eternity. The gathered soldiers erupted in good-natured laughter, each species eager to assert their own superiority. It was a common pastime among coalition forces, these informal competitions of military pride and prowess. Commander Drex of the Titanite Guard, his crystalline form refracting the cantina's light into prismatic patterns, spoke in his characteristic resonant tone. Speed matters little when facing Titanite resilience. Our warriors have been known to continue fighting even after losing entire limbs. There are documented cases of Titanite soldiers operating for weeks with critical structural damage that would incapacitate any organic species. Physical resilience is admirable, interjected Major Tell of the Psychonic Dominion, her ethereal form shimmering slightly as she projected her thoughts directly into the minds of those present. But, true military superiority comes from mental discipline. Psychonic forces can coordinate instantaneously across vast distances, share tactical information in real time, and anticipate enemy movements before they're even conceived. The debate continued, each species highlighting their particular advantages. The Vorthak emphasized their strength and endurance. The Serpentines boasted of their speed and flexibility. The Titanites spoke of their near-indestructible nature. The Psychonics demonstrated their mental superiority. Other species chimed in with their own claims. The aquatic abyssal could fight in environments that would kill most others, the insectoid hive mind operated with perfect coordination, the energy-based luminals could phase through solid matter. It was then that Corporal First Class Elena Rodriguez entered the cantina, her standard coalition uniform marking her as belonging to one of the newest member species. She was unremarkable by most galactic standards, average height for her species at about 1.7 meters, brown hair pulled back in regulation style, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of military training, but nothing that particularly impressed the seasoned veterans already present. Ah, Captain Zexhai noticed her approach to the bar. A human. How convenient. His tone carried the condescending amusement that had become common when discussing Earth's contribution to the coalition. Elena ordered her drink and turned slightly, acknowledging the group with a polite nod. She had no intention of engaging with what she could already sense was a boasting session, but military protocol demanded basic courtesy. Lieutenant Therias slithered closer, her movements fluid and hypnotic. Human, she said, the word dripping with false sweetness, we were just discussing military traditions and capabilities. Perhaps you could share some of your species' great military achievements? The request was clearly intended as mockery. Everyone present knew humanity's recent addition to the coalition and their relatively primitive technology. Elena recognized the trap for what it was, but years of military service had taught her when to pick her battles. I'm sure you've heard plenty about human military history, she replied diplomatically, taking a sip of her synthesized beverage. Oh, but we haven't, Major Tell projected with barely concealed amusement. Please, enlighten us. What great victories has humanity achieved? What fearsome military traditions do you carry? Commander Drex's crystalline form chimed with harmonic laughter. I've read some of your historical records. Quite fascinating, really. Humans fighting with primitive projectile weapons, chemical explosives, and crude armored vehicles. Your most recent conflicts involved throwing metal at each other at relatively low velocities. Low velocities, Theriasis echoed, her scales shifting to a brighter yellow. And such short ranges. Your species seems to prefer fighting within visual distance of each other. How quaint. Elena felt the familiar burn of irritation but kept her expression neutral. We've adapted to the technologies available to us at different points in our development. Adapted, Zexhai clicked his mandibles. Such a diplomatic way of saying made do with inferior equipment. Your species joined the coalition with technology barely qualifying for Class C civilization status. Most of us were exploring interstellar space while humans were still figuring out how to make their metal birds fly. The gathering crowd grew larger as word spread that they were discussing human military capability. It had become something of a sport among coalition forces, poking fun at the humans' modest contributions to joint operations. Humanity provided decent enough logistics support and their soldiers followed orders adequately, but they were generally considered the coalition's weakest military link. Captain Vexmore of the Arachnid Dominion skittered over on his 8 legs, his multiple eyes focusing on Elena with predatory interest. I've heard humans claim they have something called special forces. Is this true? What makes them special? Are they larger than normal humans? Faster? Do they possess some hidden biological advantage? Elena shook her head. Human special forces are selected and trained for specific capabilities, but they're biologically identical to other humans. This statement was met with confused chittering, clicking, and harmonic resonance that served as laughter among the various species. The concept seemed genuinely puzzling to them. So they're just regular humans who've been trained more? Lieutenant Theriasis couldn't hide her bewilderment. But what could additional training possibly accomplish that breeding or biological enhancement couldn't achieve more efficiently? Most coalition species select their elite warriors based on superior genetics or natural mutations, Major Tell explained condescendingly, as if Elena might not understand basic military science. The Vortak breed their officers for increased strength and intelligence. Serpentines undergo genetic modification to enhance their natural speed and flexibility. Titanite warriors are selected from those who naturally develop the densest crystalline structures. What could mere training possibly add to an already inferior baseline? Elena realized she was being systematically humiliated, but she also recognized something else in their questions. These species, for all their individual advantages, seemed genuinely perplexed by the concept of overcoming natural limitations through training and determination alone. Human training focuses on mental resilience, tactical flexibility, and the ability to operate effectively in any environment or situation, she explained carefully. Commander Drex resonated with amusement. Mental resilience? Against a psychonic, mental resilience is irrelevant. Tactical flexibility? The hive mind operates with perfect coordination and can instantly adapt strategies across thousands of individuals simultaneously. Environmental adaptability? Please. Subcommander Glix of the Cryogenic Imperium, whose species thrived in temperatures that would instantly freeze most organic life, added his perspective. Humans can barely survive in environments slightly outside their narrow atmospheric and temperature ranges without artificial assistance. Your species requires constant technological support just to exist in most of the galaxy's standard operating environments. And, yet, Elena said quietly, human forces have consistently met or exceeded performance expectations in every joint operation since joining the coalition. Yes, Captain Zexhai acknowledged with false generosity, humans are adequate. Adequate soldiers, adequate logistics coordinators, adequate support personnel. No one questions your adequacy. The word adequate hung in the air like an insult, which was precisely how it was intended. Colonel Rethmar of the Predator caste, a species known for their hunting prowess and warrior culture, decided to join the conversation. His scarred hide and collection of trophies from various battles marked him as a veteran of numerous conflicts. I've served alongside human units, he growled in his deep, rumbling voice. They follow orders well enough. But, in actual combat situations, they lack the natural instincts that make a true warrior. When facing superior opponents, they tend to rely heavily on technology and numbers rather than individual skill. Technology they barely understand, added Captain Vexmore. Most human equipment is either provided by coalition allies or reverse-engineered from captured technology. They're essentially using tools beyond their natural comprehension. Elena had remained calm through most of this, but the suggestion that humans couldn't understand their own technology struck a particular nerve. Human engineers and scientists contributed to the development of several key coalition technologies currently in use. Contributed to, Lieutenant Thurot SS emphasized. As junior partners under the guidance of more advanced species. Your greatest scientific achievements required supervision and correction from psionic researchers or Titanite engineers. The cantina had grown quiet around their conversation. Other patrons were listening with evident interest to what had become an impromptu debate about human military worth. Elena could see the expressions of amusement, curiosity, and, in some cases, mild sympathy from the gathered crowd. She finished her drink and prepared to leave, having no desire to continue what was clearly intended as public humiliation disguised as friendly discussion. But, as she turned to go, Commander Drex's harmonics stopped her. Surely you have some story of human military prowess to share? Some tale of remarkable victory against overwhelming odds? Every species has such stories, even if they're exaggerated. Elena paused, considering her response. She thought about the human military traditions these aliens found so amusing. The stories of ordinary soldiers accomplishing extraordinary things through sheer determination. The battles won not through superior technology or natural advantages, but through stubborn refusal to give up when any rational analysis would suggest defeat was inevitable. We have stories, she said simply. But I don't think you'd find them particularly impressive. Try us, urged Major Tell, her projection carrying genuine curiosity now. We've shared tales of our own species' achievements. Surely turnabout is fair play. Elena looked around the cantina, taking in the faces of beings from dozens of worlds, each representing species that had achieved interstellar travel and military might that dwarfed anything in human history. How could she explain the significance of battles fought with primitive weapons on a single world to beings who commanded fleets capable of sterilizing entire planets? Human military tradition doesn't focus on individual superiority or advanced technology, she began carefully. Our stories tend to be about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Captain Zexai's mandibles clicked dismissively. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. How wonderfully vague. Could you be more specific? Well, Elena considered her options. She could walk away and end this humiliation, or she could try to explain something she suspected these aliens couldn't truly comprehend. There was a battle called Thermopylae. 300 Spartan warriors and their allies held off an army of hundreds of thousands for days. Held off? Colonel Rethmar leaned forward with interest. You mean they defeated this army? No, Elena admitted. They all died. The cantina erupted in confused sounds from multiple species. The concept of celebrating a defeat was evidently foreign to their military traditions. Lieutenant Thurias's scale shifted to orange, indicating complete bewilderment. You celebrate a battle in which your soldiers died? That makes no sense. They died, but they accomplished their mission, Elena explained. They bought time for the rest of their people to prepare for the invasion. Their sacrifice saved thousands of other lives. Major Tell projected skepticism. So your great military tradition celebrates tactical failures that result in the death of your own forces? Elena realized she was failing to communicate something fundamental about human military thinking. It celebrates the willingness to pay any price to protect what matters most. Any price, Commander Drex resonated thoughtfully. Including the inefficient expenditure of military resources? Including their own lives. The cantina fell silent as the various species contemplated this concept. For most coalition military traditions, the death of trained soldiers was considered a failure of leadership or tactics. The idea that soldiers might deliberately choose death to accomplish a mission was unusual. Captain Vexmore finally broke the silence. This seems tactically unsound. Dead soldiers cannot fight future battles. The logical approach would be to withdraw, preserve your forces, and find a more advantageous engagement. Sometimes withdrawal isn't an option, Elena replied. Sometimes you're the only thing standing between the enemy and innocent people who can't protect themselves. Then, you use better technology, superior numbers, or enhanced biological capabilities, Subcommander Glick suggested practically. You don't simply accept death as an outcome. Elena shook her head. Humans don't always have better technology or superior numbers. Sometimes all we have is the determination to keep fighting regardless of the odds. The gathering was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, Captain Zexai spoke up. These Spartans you mentioned. They were genetically enhanced warriors, correct? Bred specifically for combat superiority? No, Elena said. They were just men who had trained their entire lives to be soldiers. Men, repeated Lieutenant Thurot SS slowly. As in, biologically standard humans? Yes. And they faced hundreds of thousands of enemies with no technological advantage? Their equipment was roughly equivalent to their opponents. The aliens exchanged glances and subtle communications in their various forms. The story Elena had told seemed to violate several basic principles of military science as they understood it. Colonel Rethmar's growl carried a note of skepticism. This story cannot be accurate. No force of 300 could hold off hundreds of thousands without overwhelming technological superiority or significant defensive advantages. They had some defensive advantages, Elena conceded. They chose the battlefield carefully. But, ultimately, they were just 300 men against impossible odds. And, they all died, Major Tell reiterated, still struggling with the concept. They all died. And, this is considered a great military achievement? Elena thought carefully about how to explain something that seemed obvious to her but incomprehensible to beings from cultures that had never experienced the particular pressures that shaped human military thinking. It's considered great because they chose to do what was necessary, even knowing the cost. They could have run. They could have found excuses. They could have convinced themselves that someone else would handle the problem. But, they didn't. They stood their ground and did their duty, even when they knew it would kill them. The cantina remained quiet, but Elena could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The mocking tone from earlier had given way to something that might have been confused respect, or at least puzzlement. Subcommander Glix finally voiced what several others were thinking. Your species has very strange priorities. Elena smiled slightly for the first time since the conversation began. You're not the first to mention that. She turned to leave, but Commander Drex's harmonic voice stopped her once more. Corporal Rodriguez, his tone had lost its earlier condescension. These human military traditions, are there others like this Thermopylae? Elena paused at the cantina entrance, considering the question. Around her, beings from across the galaxy waited for her response with an attention that seemed different from their earlier mockery. Yes, she said simply. There are others. And, with that, she left the cantina, unaware that her departure marked the end of one kind of conversation and the beginning of another entirely. The conversation in the cantina continued long after Elena's departure, though its tone had shifted significantly from mockery to puzzlement. The various species found themselves grappling with concepts that didn't fit neatly into their understanding of military science and warrior culture. Captain Zexai flexed his 6 arms thoughtfully, his carapace reflecting the cantina's lights in shifting patterns. 300 against hundreds of thousands, he repeated for perhaps the 10th time since Elena left. The mathematics alone should have made resistance pointless. Lieutenant Theriasis coiled herself more tightly in her chair, scales still displaying the orange hue of confusion. But, she said they knew they would die. They chose to fight anyway. This defies basic survival instincts shared by virtually every sentient species. Perhaps, suggested Major Tell, her ethereal form shimmering as she projected thoughts to the group, the story is metaphorical rather than historical. Many species have legends that exaggerate actual events for cultural purposes. Commander Drex resonated disagreement. Coalition intelligence files contain human historical data. I could verify the account if anyone is genuinely interested in factual accuracy rather than speculation. The suggestion hung in the air for a moment before Colonel Rethmar growled his agreement. Access the files. I want to understand what drives a species to celebrate tactical disasters. Drex's crystalline form pulsed briefly as he interfaced with the station's data networks. Information flowed through quantum channels to his consciousness, processed and analyzed according to Titanite cognitive patterns that could handle vast amounts of data simultaneously. What he found left him temporarily speechless, his harmonic voice silent for the first time anyone present could remember. Commander, prompted Captain Vexmore, his multiple eyes focused intently on Drex's motionless form. When Drex finally spoke, his usually resonant voice carried undertones of something that might have been disbelief. The human's account was understated. The actual historical record indicates that King Leonidas of Sparta led 300 of his royal guard, plus approximately 7,000 other Greek warriors, against a Persian force estimated at between 1 and 2 million soldiers. The cantina fell silent except for the background hum of life support systems. 2 million? Subcommander Glix's voice cracked slightly despite his species' usual emotional control. That's not a battle. That's mass suicide. The Persian force had technological advantages as well, Drex continued, still processing the information. Superior numbers, better logistics, naval support, siege equipment, and warriors from dozens of conquered territories with diverse fighting styles and capabilities. Captain Zexai's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. How long did this battle last before the inevitable slaughter? 7 days. The silence that followed was so complete that several species-enhanced hearing could detect the individual heartbeats of their companions. Lieutenant Thurai SS was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 days? A force of 7,000 held off 2 million attackers for 7 days? According to multiple historical sources, yes. The narrow pass at Thermopylae negated much of the numerical advantage, but the mathematical odds remained extreme. Major Tell projected confusion so intense it created a mild psychic feedback loop that affected several telepathically sensitive species nearby. This violates fundamental principles of warfare. No force should have been able to maintain coherent defensive positions under such circumstances. Colonel Rethmar's scarred hide rippled as ancient hunting instincts struggled to process information that contradicted everything he understood about predator-prey dynamics. What was their kill ratio? Drex accessed more files. Conservative estimates suggest the Greeks eliminated between 20 and 50,000 Persian soldiers while losing approximately 4,000 of their own. 50,000, Captain Vexmore repeated slowly. They were outnumbered nearly 300 to 1 and still achieved a positive kill ratio? The records indicate that Persian morale began deteriorating significantly after the first few days. Many units reportedly refused direct assault orders. Subcommander Glix spoke up from his corner of the cantina. This explains nothing. Superior defensive positions and tactical advantages can account for some disparity, but these numbers suggest something else entirely. What do you mean? Asked Thorat SS. I mean, Glix's voice carried the precision his species was known for. The 2 million soldiers should have been able to simply walk over 7,000 defenders through sheer mass, regardless of defensive positions. The fact that they didn't suggests the defenders possessed some quality that the raw numbers don't capture. Before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the discussion. You're beginning to understand. The assembled soldiers turned to see an elderly human approaching their group. He was clearly well past standard military retirement age, his gray hair and weathered features speaking of decades of service. His uniform bore the insignia of a coalition senior military advisor, a rank typically reserved for specialists whose expertise transcended normal command structures. Advisor. Captain Zexai checked the human's name tape. Kowalski. I don't believe we've met. The old human smiled and gestured to an empty chair. Mind if I join you? I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about Thermopylae. Please, Commander Drex's harmonic voice carried newfound respect. We were attempting to understand the tactical implications of the battle your colleague described. Kowalski settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had endured decades of military service. Elena told you about the 300 Spartans? She did, confirmed Lieutenant Thurai SS. Though the actual numbers appear to have been significantly larger. Elena has a tendency toward modesty, Kowalski observed. She probably didn't want to sound boastful. But, you're right about the numbers. And, you're also right that they don't tell the whole story. Major Tell leaned forward, her projection carrying genuine curiosity. Then, what does tell the whole story? Kowalski was quiet for a moment, studying the faces around him. Finally, he spoke. Have any of you ever been in a situation where retreat wasn't an option? Of course, Colonel Rethmar growled immediately. Every warrior faces such moments. No, Kowalski shook his head. I don't mean tactically impossible retreat. I mean situations where retreat would mean the destruction of everything you were sworn to protect. Where running away would save your life but doom innocent people to slavery, torture, or death. The alien soldiers exchanged glances. Several started to respond, then stopped, reconsidering their answers. Captain Vexmore finally spoke. The Arachnid Dominion has strong protective instincts regarding our egg chambers. Warriors will fight to the death to defend breeding areas. But, you have multiple breeding areas, Kowalski pointed out gently. If one fell, your species would continue. What if you were defending the last one? The final chance for your people to survive? That's... Vexmore's multiple eyes blinked in sequence. That's an entirely different psychological framework. Exactly, Kowalski nodded. The Greeks at Thermopylae weren't just defending a piece of ground. They were defending the concept of freedom itself. If they failed, their families would become slaves. Their children would grow up in bondage. Their entire way of life would cease to exist. Subcommander Glix leaned forward. But surely the logical response would be to seek reinforcements, develop better technology, or negotiate favorable terms. Fighting a hopeless battle accomplishes nothing. Does it? Kowalski's voice carried a challenge. Let me ask you something. When word spread throughout Greece about what 300 Spartans and their allies had accomplished at Thermopylae, what do you think happened? The alien soldiers looked at each other uncertainly. I'll tell you what happened, Kowalski continued. Every Greek city-state that had been considering surrender or collaboration suddenly found the courage to resist. The Persian Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, suddenly appeared vulnerable. The sacrifice at Thermopylae inspired a resistance movement that ultimately drove the invaders from Greek soil entirely. Commander Drex's crystalline form chimed thoughtfully. So the tactical defeat served a strategic purpose? More than that, Kowalski said. It demonstrated something that the Persian Empire, for all its size and power, couldn't understand or counter. It showed that some things are worth dying for, and that people willing to die for their principles can't be defeated by conventional means. Lieutenant Therias's scale shifted to a pale blue, indicating deep thought. You're suggesting that the willingness to accept death as an outcome provides some form of tactical advantage? I'm suggesting, Kowalski replied carefully, that an enemy who won't surrender, won't negotiate, and won't retreat presents unique challenges that can't be solved through superior numbers or technology alone. Major Tell projected confusion tinged with something that might have been respect. But this seems inefficient. Surely there are more logical approaches to military resistance? Kowalski smiled. You're thinking like beings whose species achieved spaceflight through gradual technological advancement and rational decision-making. Humans evolved differently. How so? Asked Captain Zexhai. We evolved as persistence hunters, Kowalski explained. Our ancestors didn't have the speed of the serpentines, the strength of the Vortak, or the natural weapons of the predator caste. What we had was the ability to keep going when every instinct said to stop. We could track prey for days, weeks if necessary. We'd follow wounded animals until they collapsed from exhaustion, blood loss, or simple despair. The alien soldiers listened with growing attention as Kowalski continued. This shaped our psychology in ways that other species might find difficult to understand. When humans commit to something, really commit, we don't stop. We don't calculate odds or weigh costs. We just keep going until we succeed or die trying. Colonel Rethmar's growl carried newfound interest. You're describing a form of warfare that transcends rational limitations. Not transcends, Kowalski corrected. Ignores. There's a difference. Humans are perfectly capable of rational thought and strategic planning. But, when pushed to our limits, when everything we care about is threatened, we can set rationality aside and operate on pure determination. Subcommander Glix spoke up. This still doesn't explain how numerical inferiority can be overcome through determination alone. Doesn't it? Kowalski turned to face the cryogenic representative. How do you defeat an enemy who refuses to be defeated? How do you break the morale of soldiers who have already accepted death? How do you negotiate with people who would rather die than compromise? The questions hung in the cantina's recycled air as the assembled soldiers contemplated implications they'd never considered. Captain Vexmore eventually voiced what several others were thinking. Such an enemy would be problematic to face. Problematic, Kowalski agreed. That's one way to put it. Commander Drex's harmonic voice carried new undertones as he spoke. You're suggesting that this psychological framework is common among human military forces? I'm suggesting, Kowalski replied, that every human military unit is trained to operate under the assumption that retreat may not be an option. We prepare our soldiers for the possibility that they may need to sacrifice their lives for the mission. Every unit? Lieutenant Tharass's scale shifted to orange again. Even support personnel? Every unit, Kowalski confirmed. Cooks, mechanics, communications specialists, medical personnel. They all receive training in small unit tactics and combat operations. Because human military doctrine assumes that any unit, regardless of its primary function, may find itself in a situation where fighting becomes necessary. Major Tell projected bewilderment. That seems extraordinarily inefficient. Specialized personnel should focus on their areas of expertise. Should they? Kowalski challenged. What happens when your communications specialists come under direct attack? Do they surrender and compromise your entire operational security? Or do they fight back? They would be evacuated by dedicated combat personnel, Subcommander Glick stated matter-of-factly. And if evacuation isn't possible? If the combat personnel are elsewhere, or dead, or cut off? The silence that followed was answer enough. Kowalski continued his explanation. Human military doctrine acknowledges that war is chaotic and unpredictable. Plans fail. Communication breaks down. Units get separated. When that happens, every human soldier is expected to continue fighting regardless of their primary specialty or the odds they face. This begins to explain the tactical anomalies we've observed in joint operations, mused Commander Drex. Human units have demonstrated unusual resilience when faced with unexpected challenges. You mean their tendency to keep fighting when logic would suggest retreat? Asked Captain Zexhai. Exactly. We attributed it to poor tactical judgment or inadequate leadership. We never considered that it might be intentional doctrine. Colonel Rathmar leaned back in his chair, his scarred hide rippling with thought. This explains some things, but raises other questions. If human soldiers are trained to fight to the death, how do they maintain unit cohesion? How do they avoid reckless sacrifice that serves no strategic purpose? Kowalski smiled. That's where the other half of human military tradition comes in. We don't just teach our soldiers when to die. We teach them what's worth dying for. Meaning, prompted Lieutenant Tharass. Meaning that human soldiers are trained to distinguish between pointless sacrifice and necessary sacrifice. The Spartans at Thermopylae didn't throw their lives away in a gesture of defiance. They traded their lives for time, for inspiration, for a strategic advantage that their deaths could provide. Major Tell projected fascination despite her confusion. So the willingness to die is balanced by judgment about when death serves a purpose? Exactly. Human military training emphasizes both courage and wisdom. We teach soldiers to be willing to die for their comrades, their mission, or their people, but we also teach them to make that sacrifice count. Subcommander Glick spoke thoughtfully. This suggests a level of psychological conditioning that goes beyond normal military training. It's not conditioning, Kowalski corrected. It's culture. For thousands of years, human societies have honored those who sacrificed themselves for others. Our legends, our literature, our values all reinforce the idea that some things are worth dying for. But, surely this creates problems with troop retention, Captain Vexmore observed practically. If soldiers expect to die, recruitment must be difficult. Kowalski laughed. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But, humans have never had trouble finding people willing to serve in combat roles. If anything, military service is considered honorable precisely because of the risks involved. The alien soldiers exchanged glances full of disbelief. Let me understand this correctly, Commander Drex's harmonic voice carried careful precision. Humans volunteer for military service despite knowing they may be expected to die? And this tradition makes military service more honorable rather than less attractive? That's correct. And this has been consistent throughout human history? For as long as we have historical records, yes. The cantina fell quiet again as the representatives of various galactic civilizations struggled to process a concept that seemed to violate basic evolutionary survival instincts. Finally, Lieutenant Tharass spoke up. Advisor Kowalski, you mentioned that there were other stories like Thermopylae. Could you share another example? Kowalski considered the request carefully. He could see that his audience was genuinely interested now. their earlier mockery replaced by curiosity and, perhaps a touch of concern. "There are many such stories," he said eventually. "But, perhaps you'd like to hear about a more recent example? Something from Earth's technological era?" The assembled soldiers nodded eagerly. "Very well," Kowalski settled back in his chair. "Let me tell you about a place called Bastogne, and what happened there during something humans call the Battle of the Bulge." Advisor Kowalski paused to collect his thoughts while the alien soldiers waited with newfound attention. The cantina around them had grown quieter as word spread of the unusual discussion taking place, and several other coalition personnel had drifted closer to listen. December 1944, Kowalski began. Earth's second global war was in its final stages, though nobody knew it at the time. The German forces launched a desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied lines and recapture vital supply ports. Captain Zexhai flexed his arms impatiently. "German? Allied? You'll need to provide context for those unfamiliar with human historical factions." Of course, Kowalski nodded. The Germans represented a fascist regime that had conquered most of Europe and was attempting to establish permanent dominance over the continent. The Allies were a coalition of democratic nations fighting to stop this expansion and liberate the occupied territories. Lieutenant Thurot*'s scales shifted to a thoughtful blue. So this was a defensive war against an expansionist empire? Precisely. By late 1944, the German forces were being pushed back on all fronts, but they still possessed significant military capability and were becoming increasingly desperate. Desperate enemies can be extremely dangerous. Commander Drex resonated agreement. Cornered opponents often fight with increased ferocity. Please continue. The German offensive caught the Allied forces by surprise, Kowalski continued. Within days, several American units found themselves surrounded in small Belgian towns throughout the region. But the most significant stand took place at Bastogne, a small crossroads town that controlled access to several major highways. Major Tell projected curiosity. What made this location strategically important? Control of those roads, Kowalski explained. Whoever held Bastogne could dictate the movement of forces throughout the entire region. The Germans needed the town to maintain their offensive momentum. The Allies needed to hold it to prevent German forces from reaching their supply lines. Subcommander Glix leaned forward. What were the force dispositions? The German forces committed approximately 45,000 troops to the siege, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The American defenders numbered roughly 18,000, mostly paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, with some additional armored and artillery units. 2.5 to 1 odds, calculated Captain Vexmore. Significant, but not insurmountable with proper defensive positions. True, Kowalski agreed. But there were complicating factors. The Americans were low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Winter weather prevented air resupply for several critical days. Many of the soldiers lacked proper cold weather equipment and were suffering from frostbite and exposure. Colonel Rathmar's scarred hide rippled with interest. Environmental factors can be decisive in siege warfare. How long were they expected to hold? Nobody knew, Kowalski replied. Relief forces were en route, but their arrival time was uncertain. The defenders might have needed to hold for days or weeks. Lieutenant Thurot*'s scales darkened with concern. Besieged forces in such conditions would typically seek terms for honorable surrender. The Germans thought so too, Kowalski smiled grimly. On December 22, German commander Heinrich von Luttwitz sent a delegation under a white flag to demand the surrender of Bastogne. He offered honorable terms and warned that refusal would result in the total destruction of the garrison. A reasonable offer under the circumstances, observed Commander Drex. What was the American response? Kowalski's smile widened. The American commander was General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne. When presented with the surrender ultimatum, his response was brief and to the point. Which was, prompted Major Tell. Nuts. The cantina fell silent as the assembled aliens processed this information. Nuts, repeated Captain Zexhai slowly. As in, the edible seeds of certain trees? Nuts is also a colloquial human expression meaning absolutely not or go to hell, Kowalski explained. McAuliffe's staff had to explain to the confused German delegation that the general was refusing their offer in the strongest possible terms. Sub-Commander Glix's voice carried disbelief. The human commander rejected honorable surrender terms in favor of continuing a siege he couldn't win? He didn't see it as a siege he couldn't win, Kowalski corrected. He saw it as a mission he couldn't abandon. His orders were to hold Bastogne. The conditions under which he might abandon those orders didn't include enemy threats or superior numbers. Lieutenant Thurias's scales shifted through several colors rapidly. But, surely tactical flexibility allows for withdrawal when facing impossible odds? Not in this case, Kowalski shook his head. The strategic importance of Bastogne meant that abandoning it would compromise the entire Allied position in the region. McAuliffe understood that his soldiers might die defending the town, but he also understood that letting the Germans take it would result in far more deaths elsewhere. Captain Vexmore clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. So he chose certain death for his troops to prevent probable death for others? He chose to trust his troops to accomplish a mission that seemed impossible, Kowalski corrected again. There's a difference. McAuliffe didn't expect his men to die. He expected them to find a way to win. Against 2.5 to 1 odds, in winter conditions, with limited supplies? Colonel Rethmar's growl carried skepticism. Against those odds, yes. Major Tell projected confusion. How could any rational military leader expect victory under such circumstances? Kowalski was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because he knew something about his troops that the Germans didn't understand. Which was that they were paratroopers. Commander Drex resonated puzzlement. I'm unfamiliar with this term in human military context. Paratroopers are soldiers trained to jump out of aircraft behind enemy lines, Kowalski explained. Their entire doctrine is based on being surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from support. They're not just trained to survive such conditions, they're trained to thrive in them. The alien soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. The concept of deliberately placing troops in impossible situations seemed to violate basic military science. Let me make sure I understand, Lieutenant Thurias said slowly. Humans deliberately developed military units designed to operate while surrounded and outnumbered? We did. And these units were considered elite rather than expendable? Paratroopers are among our most respected military units, Kowalski confirmed. They volunteer for the most dangerous missions specifically because those missions require soldiers who won't break under pressure. Sub-Commander Glix spoke up. This seems counterintuitive. Elite units should be preserved for decisive engagements, not sacrificed in hopeless situations. Who said the situation was hopeless? Kowalski challenged. The 101st Airborne had been surrounded before. At Normandy, they'd been scattered across enemy-held territory with minimal equipment and no clear objectives. They'd not only survived but accomplished their mission. And, at Bastogne, asked Captain Zexai. At Bastogne, they had clear objectives, defensive positions, and support from additional units. From their perspective, the conditions were better than many previous engagements. Colonel Rethmar leaned forward with obvious interest. You're saying these paratroopers actually preferred being surrounded? I'm saying they were comfortable with it, Kowalski replied. Being surrounded meant the enemy was all around them, which meant they couldn't miss when they shot back. It meant they didn't need to worry about retreat routes or escape plans. They could focus entirely on fighting. Major Tell projected fascination despite her confusion. This represents a completely different psychological approach to warfare. It's the approach that won the battle, Kowalski stated simply. For 6 days, 18,000 Americans held off 45,000 Germans in sub-freezing weather with limited supplies. They broke every German attack, maintained their positions, and kept the crossroads open for Allied reinforcements. 6 days, Commander Drex repeated. And the outcome? On December 26, elements of the Third Army broke through German lines and relieved the siege. The German offensive collapsed shortly afterward, and, within months, the war in Europe was over. The cantina remained quiet as the assembled soldiers contemplated the implications of what they'd heard. Advisor Kowalski, Lieutenant Thurias said eventually, this story suggests that human military doctrine intentionally creates impossible situations for your own forces. Not impossible, Kowalski corrected. Difficult. There's a significant difference. How so? An impossible situation has no solution. A difficult situation simply requires extraordinary effort, creativity, or sacrifice to resolve. Humans specialize in difficult situations. Captain Vexmore's multiple eyes focused intently on the elderly human. You speak as if this is a deliberate choice rather than a consequence of inferior technology or numbers. It is a deliberate choice, Kowalski confirmed. Human military doctrine is based on the assumption that we'll usually be fighting opponents with some form of advantage over us. Better technology, superior numbers, more resources, whatever. So we train our soldiers to win anyway. How? Asked Sub-Commander Glix. By being willing to pay prices our enemies won't pay. By taking risks our enemies won't take. By continuing to fight when our enemies expect us to surrender. Colonel Rethmar's growl carried newfound respect. You're describing a warrior culture built around defying conventional military logic. We prefer to think of it as expanding the definition of what's militarily possible, Kowalski replied with a slight smile. Commander Drex's crystalline form chimed thoughtfully. These examples you shared, Thermopylae and Bastogne, they both involved holding defensive positions against superior numbers. True. Are there examples of human forces achieving victory through offensive action against superior opponents? Kowalski considered the question. Many. But, perhaps you'd prefer a more recent example? Something from humanity's early space age? The assembled aliens nodded eagerly, their earlier mockery completely forgotten. Very well, Kowalski settled back in his chair. Let me tell you about the first Martian rebellion, and how a handful of human colonists took on the most powerful military force in the solar system. Major Tell projected intense curiosity. This occurred before human contact with galactic civilization? About 50 years before first contact, yes. Mars had been terraformed and colonized, but it remained under direct control of Earth's government. The colonists had no political representation, no military forces, and no legal recourse when Earth decided to impose new taxes and restrictions on Martian trade. So they rebelled? Lieutenant Theriass's scale shifted to an interested green. They did. With mining equipment, civilian vehicles, and improvised weapons against Earth's colonial defense force. What were the odds? Asked Captain Zexhai. Kowalski smiled grimly. Approximately 300 colonists against a full battle group of Earth's space navy, including orbital bombardment platforms, atmospheric fighters, and 2 full regiments of professional soldiers. 300 again? Sub-Commander Glix's voice carried amazement. Is this number significant in human culture? It's not the number that's significant, Kowalski replied. It's what those 300 accomplished. Commander Drex resonated anticipation. Which was? They won. The cantina erupted in sounds of disbelief from multiple species. Won how? Colonel Rethmar demanded. 300 civilians cannot defeat professional military forces supported by orbital assets. They didn't defeat them in conventional battle, Kowalski explained. They made the cost of maintaining control higher than Earth was willing to pay. Through guerrilla warfare, asked Captain Vexmore. Through something more fundamental, Kowalski replied. They demonstrated that free people who refuse to be enslaved cannot be held by force alone, no matter how overwhelming that force might be. Major Tell projected confusion. I don't understand the distinction. The distinction, Kowalski said carefully, is that the Earth forces could destroy the Martian colonies, but they couldn't control them. Every time they captured a facility, the colonists would sabotage it. Every time they arrested leaders, new ones would emerge. Every time they imposed new restrictions, resistance would increase. But surely orbital bombardment could have ended the rebellion immediately? Lieutenant Theriass pointed out. It could have, Kowalski agreed. But that would have destroyed the infrastructure Earth wanted to exploit. You can't collect taxes from dead colonists or profit from destroyed mining facilities. Commander Drex's harmonics carried understanding. So the rebels made themselves valuable enough to keep alive but costly enough to leave alone? Exactly. They proved that the resources required to suppress them exceeded the value of controlling them. Sub-Commander Glix leaned back in his chair. This suggests a form of warfare that operates outside traditional military parameters. Human warfare often does, Kowalski confirmed. We fight with economics, politics, psychology, and moral principles as much as we fight with weapons. But how did 300 people coordinate such a campaign against professional military opposition? Colonel Rethmar asked. By understanding that they weren't fighting a war, Kowalski replied. They were proving a point. Which was that human beings will not willingly accept subjugation, regardless of the consequences. That freedom is worth any price, including death. That a government that rules without consent rules illegitimately, no matter how powerful its military forces. The alien soldiers sat in contemplative silence as they processed this information. Finally, Captain Zexai spoke. These stories you shared, they all involve humans choosing conflict over submission, even when submission would be more logical. That's correct. And, you present this as a positive cultural trait? I present it as a defining cultural trait, Kowalski corrected. Whether it's positive or negative depends on your perspective. Lieutenant Thorot's scale shifted to orange again. From a military standpoint, such predictable behavior could be considered a weakness. Enemies would know that humans won't surrender under any circumstances. Could be, Kowalski agreed. But, it could also be considered a strength. Enemies would know that defeating humans requires total victory or total destruction. There's no middle ground, no negotiated settlement, no honorable surrender. You either win completely, or you lose. That seems to limit diplomatic options, observed Major Tell. It does, Kowalski acknowledged. But, it also eliminates certain forms of warfare entirely. No enemy can hope to conquer humans through intimidation or gradual pressure. They'd need to commit to total war from the beginning, which most rational opponents would prefer to avoid. Commander Drex resonated thoughtfully. So human military doctrine serves as a form of deterrent as much as a fighting philosophy? Exactly. When your enemies know you'll never give up, they're much more likely to seek peaceful solutions to conflicts. Sub-Commander Glix spoke up. But, this raises an important question, Advisor. These examples from human history all involve conflicts between human factions. How would such tactics apply against alien opponents with different psychology, technology, or capabilities? The question hung in the cantina's recycled air as every present alien focused their attention on the elderly human's response. Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, his weathered features reflecting decades of military experience and hard-won wisdom. That, he said finally, is a question humanity has been preparing to answer since we joined the coalition. Meaning? Meaning that every human in coalition service has studied xenopsychology, alien military tactics, and interspecies warfare theory. We've analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of every coalition member species. We've developed contingency plans for potential conflicts with each of our current allies. The alien soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Not because we expect such conflicts, Kowalski clarified quickly. But, because human military doctrine requires us to be prepared for any possibility. Even war against species with superior technology and capabilities, asked Captain Zexai. Especially war against superior opponents, Kowalski replied. That's what humans do best. The cantina fell silent once again as the assembled aliens contemplated the implications of sharing a military alliance with a species whose primary expertise appeared to be fighting impossible wars against superior opponents. Finally, Colonel Rethmar broke the silence with a question that seemed to echo the thoughts of everyone present. Advisor Kowalski, given everything you've told us, I have to ask, what would happen if humans ever found themselves at war with the rest of the coalition? Kowalski's smile disappeared entirely as he considered the question. When he finally answered, his voice carried a quiet certainty that sent chills through several species-equivalent nervous systems. I honestly hope, he said, that none of us ever has to find out. The silence that followed Kowalski's ominous statement stretched uncomfortably long. Several alien officers shifted in their seats, suddenly, aware that their casual mockery of human military capability might have revealed more about their own vulnerabilities than about human weaknesses. Lieutenant Thoraiss was the first to find her voice, though her scales had shifted to a nervous pattern of yellow and orange. Advisor, surely you're not suggesting that humans would actually plan for conflict with coalition allies? I'm not suggesting it, Kowalski replied calmly. I'm stating it as established fact. Every human military academy includes courses on coalition member species' tactical preferences, technological capabilities, and potential weaknesses. It's standard curriculum. Captain Zexai's mandibles clicked rapidly. This seems concerning. Are humans expecting betrayal from their allies? Humans are expecting nothing, Kowalski clarified. But, we're prepared for everything. There's a significant difference. Major Tell projected confusion mixed with growing unease. Could you elaborate on that distinction? Kowalski considered his words carefully. Human military history has taught us that allies can become enemies, friends can become threats, and peaceful relationships can deteriorate into warfare with little warning. We don't assume this will happen, but we recognize that it could happen. And, therefore you prepare for it, Commander Drex observed, his harmonic voice carrying new undertones of wariness. We prepare for it, Kowalski confirmed. Just as I'm certain other coalition species have contingency plans for potential human aggression. The alien soldiers exchanged uncomfortable glances, several of them looking distinctly guilty. Subcommander Glix cleared his throat. Such preparations are standard military prudence. Exactly, Kowalski agreed with a slight smile. The difference is that human preparations tend to be more thorough than most species consider necessary. How thorough? Asked Colonel Rethmar, his scarred hide rippling with concern. Kowalski was quiet for a moment, then seemed to reach a decision. Are you familiar with the Terran Strategic Studies Institute? I am not, admitted Captain Vexmore. It's a human military research organization dedicated to analyzing potential threat scenarios. For the past 15 years, since humanity joined the coalition, they've been conducting war games and strategic analyses based on hypothetical conflicts with various alien species. The cantina had grown very quiet, with other coalition personnel nearby straining to hear the conversation. What sort of analyses? Lieutenant Theriss asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't certain she wanted to know. Comprehensive ones, Kowalski replied. For example, they've identified 17 different approaches to neutralizing Vorthack military advantages, 12 methods of countering serpentine speed and agility, and 8 strategies for defeating Titanite defensive capabilities. Captain Zexai's 6 arms tensed visibly. 17 approaches? Would you like me to outline a few? No, Zexai said quickly, then reconsidered. Yes. I think we need to understand what humans consider our weaknesses. Kowalski nodded. The Vorthack rely heavily on physical strength and endurance. Your soldiers can carry heavier equipment, fight longer, and absorb more damage than most species. But this creates dependencies that can be exploited. Such as? Your enhanced metabolism requires significantly more calories than baseline human consumption. In a prolonged conflict, disrupting Vorthack food supplies would be more effective than direct military engagement. Starving Vorthack soldiers lose their strength advantages within days. Captain Zexai's mandibles clicked in what might have been disbelief or grudging respect. This is correct. Additionally, Kowalski continued, Vorthack combat doctrine emphasizes individual superiority and personal combat skills. You're less effective when forced to operate in environments that negate those advantages. What sort of environments? Underwater combat, zero-gravity operations, or any situation requiring precise mechanical manipulation rather than physical strength. Human forces would attempt to force engagements in such conditions whenever possible. Commander Drex's crystalline form chimed uneasily. And Titanite capabilities? Titanite warriors are nearly indestructible in conventional terms, Kowalski acknowledged. Direct fire weapons, explosives, and most energy weapons are ineffective against your crystalline structure. But you have other vulnerabilities. Which are? Sonic attacks can shatter crystalline formations. Rapid temperature changes can create structural stress fractures. And, most importantly, Titanite consciousness is tied to your physical form. Damage your crystal matrix correctly, and you can be temporarily incapacitated without permanent harm. Drex's harmonics carried genuine surprise. Human researchers identified resonance frequencies specific to Titanite crystal structures? They did. Along with optimal sonic delivery methods and targeting systems. The alien soldiers were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. Lieutenant Theriss spoke up hesitantly. And serpentine capabilities? Serpentines possess superior speed and reflexes, Kowalski observed. In individual combat, a serpentine warrior can outmaneuver most opponents. But your speed creates predictable movement patterns, and your enhanced reflexes can be overwhelmed by sufficient sensory input. Overwhelmed how? Strobe lighting, multiple audio sources, complex visual patterns. Overload serpentine sensory processing, and their speed advantage becomes a liability. they'll react to everything instead of focusing on actual threats. Theratos' scales shifted through several colors rapidly. This would be very effective. Additionally, serpentine speed requires significant energy expenditure. Force a serpentine into prolonged high-speed combat, and they'll exhaust themselves within hours. Major Tell projected growing alarm. What about psychonic capabilities? Psychonic forces represent perhaps the most significant challenge, Kowalski admitted. Your telepathic abilities provide enormous tactical advantages. But they also create dependencies and vulnerabilities. Explain. Psychonic coordination requires mental links between individuals. Disrupt those links, and psychonic forces lose their primary advantage. Human researchers have identified several methods of creating telepathic interference. Tell's projection carried shock. Telepathic interference? How is that possible? White noise generators operating at specific frequencies can disrupt psychonic communication. Additionally, certain chemical compounds can temporarily interfere with telepathic abilities when introduced into a psychonic's atmosphere. Chemical warfare against telepaths, Tell's projection carried revulsion. That's barbaric. It's effective, Kowalski replied simply. Human military doctrine prioritizes effectiveness over conventional concepts of fair play. Subcommander Glix leaned forward. What about cryogenic forces? Cryogenic troops excel in extreme cold environments where most other species can't operate effectively. But this specialization limits your operational flexibility. How so? Force cryogenic units to operate in warm environments, and they lose most of their advantages. Human forces would use orbital heating platforms, thermal weapons, and environmental manipulation to deny cryogenic troops their preferred operating conditions. Colonel Rethmar growled uneasily. And Predator caste capabilities? Predator caste warriors are natural hunters with superior tracking abilities and combat instincts. But hunting and warfare operate under different principles. Different how? Hunters typically engage single targets or small groups. Warfare involves coordinated action by large forces. Predator caste doctrine emphasizes individual prowess, which can be countered by forcing engagement with coordinated unit tactics. You mean pack hunting wouldn't be effective against human forces? Pack hunting would be very effective, Kowalski corrected. But human forces wouldn't allow pack hunting to occur. They'd use area denial weapons, automated defenses, and long-range engagement to prevent Predator caste forces from closing to their preferred combat ranges. Captain Vexmore clicked nervously. What about Arachnid Dominion capabilities? Arachnid forces excel at tunnel warfare and underground operations. Your web-building abilities allow you to control three-dimensional battlefield environments. But these capabilities require specific terrain types. And without such terrain? Without underground networks or complex structures to utilize, Arachnid forces lose their primary tactical advantages. Human forces would attempt to force surface engagements in open terrain whenever possible. The assembled aliens sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the thoroughness of human analysis of their capabilities and weaknesses. Finally, Commander Drex spoke up. Advisor Kowalski, you've described countermeasures for every major coalition species. This suggests an enormous investment in theoretical warfare against allies. It represents standard human military planning, Kowalski replied. We analyze potential threats regardless of current political relationships. But why? Asked Lieutenant Theriass. What drives humans to assume that peaceful allies might become enemies? Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, his weathered features reflecting old pain and hard-learned wisdom. Because human history has taught us that the greatest threats often come from those you least expect. Could you be more specific? Human civilization has been betrayed by allies, attacked by friends, and destroyed by those who claim to offer protection. We've learned that trust without preparation is simply a form of foolishness. Major Tell projected sympathy mixed with concern. So humans enter every alliance expecting eventual betrayal? Not expecting, Kowalski corrected once again. But prepared for the possibility. We hope for the best while planning for the worst. Subcommander Glix spoke thoughtfully. This explains the psychological framework behind the stories you shared. Humans develop military doctrine based on the assumption that they'll face superior opponents because you expect even allies to eventually become enemies. Partly, yes. But there's another factor. Which is? Humans genuinely enjoy difficult challenges. Kowalski smiled slightly. We find facing superior opponents more interesting than fighting weaker ones. The alien soldiers stared at him in disbelief. Captain Zekai's mandibles clicked rapidly. You enjoy fighting superior opponents? That seems to contradict basic survival instincts. Does it? Kowalski challenged. Which is more satisfying, defeating someone weaker than yourself, or overcoming someone stronger? Defeating someone weaker is safer, pointed out Colonel Rethmar. Safer, yes. But not more satisfying. Humans derive psychological satisfaction from overcoming challenges that test their capabilities. Commander Drex resonated confusion. This suggests that humans would actually prefer to fight the entire coalition rather than individual species. We prefer not to fight anyone, Kowalski clarified. But, if conflict became unavoidable, facing the entire coalition would represent the ultimate test of human military capability. That's insane, Lieutenant Thuriss said flatly. That's human, Kowalski replied with a grin. Major Tell projected fascination despite her growing unease. Advisor, given everything you've told us, I have to ask, do human strategists believe they could actually win a war against the entire coalition? Kowalski considered the question carefully. Human strategists believe that defining victory becomes complicated when dealing with opponents who refuse to surrender. What do you mean? I mean that the coalition could destroy human military forces, occupy human worlds, and eliminate human resistance. But they couldn't make humans accept permanent subjugation. So human victory would consist of making occupation too costly to maintain, asked Subcommander Glix. Human victory would consist of proving that some things can't be conquered, regardless of technological or numerical superiority. Captain Vexmore spoke up. But surely humans understand that total war against the coalition would result in the extinction of your species? Extinction is one possible outcome, Kowalski agreed. But not the only one. And humans have survived apparent extinction events before. When? Multiple times throughout our history. Ice ages, volcanic catastrophes, plague, warfare, environmental collapse. Humans have faced extinction dozens of times and survived by adapting, fighting, or simply refusing to die. But those were natural disasters or conflicts with other humans, Colonel Rethmar pointed out. The coalition represents unified opposition from hundreds of species with technologies far beyond human capability. True, Kowalski nodded. It would certainly be the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. And you think humans could win? I think, Kowalski replied carefully, that humans would find a way to make the victory cost more than the coalition was willing to pay. The cantina fell silent once more as the assembled aliens contemplated implications they found deeply unsettling. Finally, Lieutenant Thuriss voiced the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. Advisor Kowalski, are you trying to threaten us? Kowalski's expression showed genuine surprise. Threaten you? Not at all. You asked about human military traditions, and I've been trying to explain them honestly. But everything you've described suggests that humans are planning for war with their allies. Everything I've described suggests that humans are prepared for any possibility, Kowalski corrected. That's very different from planning for war. Is it? Asked Major Tell. Yes, Kowalski replied firmly. Planning for war means you intend to start one. Being prepared for war means you can defend yourself if someone else starts one. Commander Drex resonated thoughtfully. And humans believe this preparation serves as a deterrent? We believe it serves as insurance, Kowalski replied. The knowledge that humans won't accept defeat, won't surrender, and won't submit makes potential aggressors think very carefully before starting conflicts they might not be able to finish. Subcommander Glix leaned back in his chair. This conversation has been illuminating. But it raises a disturbing question. Which is, if humans are this prepared for conflict with allies, how prepared are they for conflict with actual enemies? Kowalski's smile returned, though it carried undertones that made several species equivalent of hackles rise. Perhaps, he said quietly, actual enemies should hope they never have to find out. The gathering began to break up shortly afterward, with various alien officers making excuses to return to their duties. But each of them carried away a fundamentally altered understanding of their human allies. As the cantina returned to its normal mix of casual conversation and off-duty socializing, Kowalski remained at the table, finishing his drink in contemplative silence. He was joined after a few minutes by Corporal Elena Rodriguez, who had returned from her own duties to find the aftermath of what had clearly been a significant discussion. "I heard you gave our alien friends a lesson in human military history," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "They asked," Kowalski replied simply. "I just answered their questions." "All of them?" "The ones they were ready to hear." Elena looked around the cantina, noting the subdued atmosphere that had replaced the earlier boisterous mood. "Think they learned anything useful?" Kowalski considered the question. "They learned that humans are more dangerous than they assumed." "Is that good or bad?" "That," Kowalski replied, raising his glass in a toast to absent friends and future challenges, "depends entirely on whether they plan to remain our allies." Outside the cantina's viewing ports, the stars shone with their eternal light, illuminating a galaxy where humanity had taken its place among ancient civilizations. But, thanks to an evening's conversation, the balance of that galactic community had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The other species now understood that their newest allies carried within them the accumulated wisdom of a species that had survived by refusing to surrender, no matter the odds. They had learned that humans possess not just the willingness to fight impossible wars, but the knowledge and preparation necessary to make such wars unwinnable for their opponents. Most importantly, they had discovered that humanity's apparent weaknesses might actually be strengths, and that underestimating human capabilities was a mistake that could prove costly in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. In military installations across the galaxy, reports would be filed, analyses would be updated, and contingency plans would be revised. The galaxy had learned something new about humanity, and that knowledge would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. But, in the cantina on Zirian Station, two human soldiers sat quietly, content in the knowledge that their species' most important military victory had been won not with weapons or technology, but with words and understanding. The message had been delivered, received, and acknowledged. Humanity's true strength lay not in their ability to fight, but in their absolute refusal to accept defeat. And now the galaxy knew it.